Colonization still exists today, and the colonizing force has an army. That army is called NATO. NATO, which used to be a defensive alliance, basically serving the purpose to protect the West from the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, has now become an organization that is used solely for the purpose to promote the interests of the Western world from an economic, political, and military stance. If you consider that NATO had no purpose after the Cold War, a purpose had to be created, and the great opportunity there was the crisis in Yugoslavia. We have documents such as the one said by Joe Biden, which is today's America's Vice President, in 1994 on the Senate hearing on the future of NATO, where he stated that that without a common enemy to unite us, we may find that our conceptions of what constitutes national interest may very well divide us. He found the common enemy in the Serbian people, because the Serbian people were already previously demonized by public relations firms such as Ruder and Finn. And this is where NATO came in to militarily act against the Serb army that has never attacked any of its member states, that has never threatened to attack any of its member states, that has never killed a single soldier of NATO. And yet they bombed the Bosnian Serbs into submission and then installed their army as the Bosnian army, which is NATO. NATO controls everything. Now, if we move on to what happened in Kosovo, their aims are even more direct, because in the Rambouillet agreement that was supposed to be signed by the Serbs, it wasn't. Why? Because they added an annex where NATO forces could station themselves throughout all of Yugoslavia, and they would not be subject to Yugoslav laws. Doesn't that sound a lot like colonization back in the day when, of course, the British would make their own laws? They wouldn't be subject to any other states that are their colonies' laws. So, of course, Yugoslavia rejected that, rejected this open threat of occupation, colonization, and were bombed by NATO, again, having not attacked a single NATO member state or threatened to attack anyone. Yugoslavia was bombed for 78 days in order to install a military dictatorship, I would say, aided by the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was very active in Kosovo and actually described by the US State Department as a terrorist organization back in 1988. Which shows that there is no morals or ethics here when we're talking about NATO. There was no such thing as a humanitarian bombing campaign that Orwell termed. It's just absurd. But rather, it was to install this colonizing force in Kosovo, which established Camp Bondsteel, the second largest U.S. foreign military base outside Germany, and used to take over, for example, the most valuable piece of real estate in the Balkans, which is called Trepča. Now, Trepča is a mine that includes huge reserves of coal, zinc, but also cadmium, gold, and silver. And that was taken over by NATO, by KFOR forces, in order to prevent an environmental catastrophe, which NATO didn't seem to care about when it was dropping depleted uranium on Yugoslav soil. So it's more than evident that NATO today is used as a colonizing force. Wherever it goes to help those people, it doesn't leave. It just stays there and continues the interests of the Western powers that are behind it, mostly the United States. And what can normal people do against NATO? Well, nothing. That's the point, because they control the politicians. NATO does. And any politician that tries to do something against NATO, as we've seen in the case of Yugoslavia, they get bombed. So one thing that people can do, it's not against NATO, but simply not to join NATO, because when a country joins NATO, It has to get rid of all its domestic military infrastructure, domestic-made weapons. They're designed for a domestic terrain, the terrain where they're at, and buy American F-17s, F-22s, whatever, you know, American planes, and they need the parts from the Americans. So they completely rely on the Americans. They no longer have their own army. So joining NATO is the most destructive thing a country can do, not only from an economic standpoint. It costs, you have to pay to be a member of NATO, you pay. And your children go to wars that America is waging, not to stop terrorism or anything like that, but for their own oil / money / whatever interests. So the only good thing about NATO is that the politicians from that country that joins NATO get really rich. And this is very good for them, but very bad for the people. So I wouldn't say that there is anything positive for the people in NATO, and that NATO is simply a colonizing force of the 21st century that should be stopped.